Hello. Organisms, in order to survive and in order to reproduce, need to be able to take the information out of their environment and process it and to react to it, to do something, to change something about their biochemistry or their physiology or their behavior in order to avoid freezing to death or boiling to death or being eaten by a predator or eating a toxic plant or starving to death. So uh, this applies to every organism, including unicellular organisms like bacteria or uh, archaea or protists. So those unicellular organisms, all they need to do is to have molecules on their surfaces and inside that are going to act like sensory systems, like sensory organs, monitoring various aspects of their environment and being able, as a single cell, to process that information and do something about, like swim away from the light or swim towards food or something like that. When we get to multicellular organisms, there's a problem there because you don't need every single cell to track everything in the environment and make its own decision what to do. The multicellular organism has to have coordination. All the cells in the organism inside of the body have to be able to coordinate their activities. In order to coordinate activities, they have to communicate with each other. Most, well, almost all the communication between cells is chemical communication. That means that one cell is making and sending a chemical, a molecule that the other cell can send, interpret as a piece of information, and do something about it. Plants, they don't have a nervous system, but they do have chemical communication between their cells. There are all sorts of tubules that connect different parts of a plant, and those tubules, when they're transferring water from one place to another in the plant, they're also transporting those signaling molecules, the chemicals that contain information that one part of the plant is sending to another part of the plant in order to coordinate that the whole plant responds in a unified way to the challenges of the environment. When you get to animals, it gets a little bit more complicated. Animals have four uh, organ systems that are involved in uh, getting the information out of the internal and external environments, processing it, and then uh, coordinating activities of all the cells in the body to respond correctly to those changes in the environment. Those are the sensory system that does the that does the sensing over the internal and external environments, which is really a modification of a part of the nervous system. Then there's the nervous system, which gives information from the central nervous system to the periphery, to the peripheral organs of other systems. There's the circadian system, which combines parts of the nervous system and parts of the endocrine system uh, in order to coordinate timing, uh, because some things just have to happen at the same time. For instance, cells in one part of the body need to uh, make and secrete hormones, and at the same time, the target cell needs to transcribe, translate, and make the receptor for that hormone. Those two things have to happen at the same time, so that has to be coordinated. Then there are sometimes, let's say, biochemical reactions that should not happen at the same time because, let's say, they're competing for the same enzyme. They're both using the same enzyme for one process or the other process. So the circadian system is going to separate them. Let's say one process happens during the day, the other one during the night. And the fourth of those systems is the endocrine system, which involves all types of chemical communications between the cells in the body. Those four systems are controlling systems. They are telling the rest of the body what to do. All the other systems, respiratory, circulatory, reproductive, urinary, all that stuff, muscular, they're all controlled. They can give feedback what's happening in their domain, but they are controlled. The sensory, nervous, circadian, and endocrine system are going to tell them what to do. There are differences between these four systems, and specifically between the kind of messaging that goes on in the nervous system versus the endocrine system. What are some of the similarities and differences between the nervous and the endocrine system? The nervous system uses really only one mechanism, one method for chemical communication. That is a release of neurotransmitter at the end of the axon of one cell, and receiving that neurotransmitter on the other side is a receptor on the membrane surface of another cell. The first cell can be a modified nerve cell, like a special sensory cell, or it can be a nerve cell. The second cell can be a nerve cell, but it can also be a muscle. Remember the neuromuscular junction from last semester, or it can be a gland, which is then going to give uh, secrete other chemical messengers that are going to send information to other parts of the body. So there's only one method. Now that method is fast. Synaptic transmission is fast. It's microseconds, and microseconds to milliseconds. It does take some time to secrete a neurotransmitter for it to pass through the synaptic cleft to bind to receptors, and then those receptors have to initiate some kind of a biochemical reaction inside of the cell. So it's not the fastest, but it's a very, very fast method. Um, on the other hand, endocrine system is uh, much broader. Endocrine system includes a large number of different molecules and several different mechanisms of transmission of information by those molecules. Uh, so it has a variety of speeds. So, for instance, direct signaling. Direct signaling is where an ion or a very small molecule uh, goes directly from one cell to the next through a pore, through a gap junction. That is not necessarily only within the nervous system. This happens in the retina of the eye, where the horizontal and amacrine cells may use direct signaling onto the bipolar cells inside of the retina. So that is modified nervous system. So that will be direct signaling inside of the nervous system. But there's also direct signaling in the heart. That's muscular system and cardiovascular system. So this is where ions pass from one muscle cell to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, ensuring that all muscle cells in the heart contract essentially simultaneously. That is the fastest possible way to transmit information by chemicals. Synaptic transmission in the nervous system is one of the subsets of chemical signaling, which means that chemical signaling in the nervous system and the synapse is a subset of what endocrinology studies. Um, Synaptic signaling is also a subset of what we call paracrine signaling. Paracrine signaling means that one cell is synthesizing and secreting a molecule that affects the neighboring cell. So that molecule is going to go through some kind of intercellular space in order to reach the neighboring cell. So when you have a nerve cell and another nerve cell, or a nerve cell to the muscular cell, you're going to have that space being very, very narrow. Remember that the synaptic cleft is really, really tiny. And but it is a case where two neighboring cells are affecting each other. It can happen in other ways, in other different places. It's an important process in the embryonic development because cells still there's you still don't have a fully developed peripheral nervous system or anything like that. So cells are going to be synthesizing and secreting various molecules into the intercellular spaces that are going to affect the development of the neighboring cells. Um, One thing that happens with the paracrine signaling is that the same molecule that was secreted by that cell can also affect the cell itself. This is called autocrine signaling. When the cell synthesizes and secretes a molecule into the space around it, and that same molecule then binds on the surface receptor of that same cell, affecting something about that cell. This is how growth works. Growth hormone does not tell the cells to divide. Growth hormone tells the cells to synthesize and secrete growth factors which are related to insulin. Like growth factors, get secreted by the cell, and they're going to affect the membrane receptors. They're going to bind to membrane receptors of that same cell. They can also do it to the neighboring cell, which would make it paracrine. But let's say that we're talking right now about affecting its own, the cell from which it was made. That receptor is then going to initiate a set of biochemical reactions inside of the cell, leading to cell division. So you have for one cell, you have two. And the neighboring cell also got the same signal. So from one, you get two. And the neighboring cell from one to two. So instead of three cells, now you have six. That piece of tissue has grown. And if growth hormone is in the whole system, then the whole body is growing by cell division. Now we come to chemical messengers that are synthesized and secreted in one cell and then placed into the cardiovascular system, into the bloodstream, and the blood takes that chemical messenger far away to a very distant part of the body. It can be secreted in the pituitary, which is in the base of the brain, and go to the heart or kidney or intestine or the testes, and initiates reactions there. This is the narrow sense of endocrine. Everything we talked about so far, direct signaling, synaptic, paracrine, autocrine, all of that is part of endocrinology. All of that is, in a sense, endocrine signaling. But this is the strict sense of endocrine is that the chemical messenger is traveling from one place to a distant place using bloodstream to carry it. Of course, the target cell has to have receptors for that molecule. So, to go back to the comparisons between nervous system and the endocrine system, nervous system has one speed, very, very fast speed, but the endocrine system has a whole range of speeds from direct signaling, which is faster than synaptic, to synaptic, autocrine, and paracrine, which are fast, to slower endocrine. And then within the endocrine, you can also have different speeds. So, uh, for instance, proteins, peptides, polar molecules, like amines that have some polarity, either positive or negative charge, they're going to act through the membrane receptors on the target cell, which is going to initiate the activity of molecules inside of the cell. There's going to be a response inside of the cell. This is also very fast. It takes a few seconds for the blood to take it from one place to another, but then the response at the target is very fast. What is also important about this is that response uh, gets greatly increased because one molecule, that's one signaling molecule, binding to one receptor molecule on the surface of the cell is going to result in hundreds or thousands or millions of molecules, let's say, being made, synthesized, or activated inside of the target cell. So there's an amplification of the signal when you use those kinds of molecules. But there are other molecules, let's say steroids, thyroid hormones, melatonin. So steroids are lipids. Thyroid and melatonin are also amines, so modified amino acids, but they are non-polar, so they can easily go through the cell membrane. It takes some time to go through the cell membrane, and then they find themselves in the cytoplasm or even in the nucleus, and sooner or later they're going to bump into their receptor and bind that receptor. That takes some time. And then the hormone receptor complex is going to bind onto DNA in very specific places in the genome that has a particular sequence of ATCs and Gs that allows the receptor hormone complex to bind to it. And they're going to initiate the transcription of the gene right next to it. That gene then needs to be transcribed, the RNA edited, it goes out of the nucleus to the endoplasmatic reticulum, where it's translated, the protein is modified. This is not milliseconds. All of that takes minutes, hours, maybe days to do. But the body has evolved to use those kinds of molecules where it's not so important that the response is fast, but it's really important that the response is long lasting, because those kinds of response, steroids, thyroid, melatonin, they're going to have uh, uh, triggered a response of the target cell that is going to last for hours or maybe days, maybe months, maybe years, maybe the entire life. So, in comparison to the nervous system, which has only one speed, the speed of synaptic transmission, the endocrine system has a whole range of speeds and uses different speeds for different functions for what it has evolved to do. Some things need to be fast, some needs to be slow, some need to be amplified, some need to last longer. Uh, and so it's going to use different molecules, different mechanisms of information transmission for different functions. Another difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system is when a nerve cell fires, it is going to affect only one or a few cells. Remember how an axon, a nerve cell is going to have one axon, but the axon at the very end can split into several little, kind of mini axon endings, and each one of them can then synapse on a different, let's say, muscle cell or a different nerve cell. So the nervous system signaling is going to be very, very narrow, very specific, where the nerve cell is going to target only one or few target cells, and that's it. On the other hand, the endocrine system, when a cell secretes a molecule and puts it in the bloodstream or whatnot, is going to affect every single cell in the body that has that receptor or is showing that receptor on the membrane at that time of day or that time of year or that time of embryonic development or puberty or whatever. So every cell, so this is a very generalized response. An endocrine gland secreting a hormone can affect many different tissues in many parts of the body. It's a much more general and broader effect than what a nerve cell can do with affecting only one or a few other cells. Uh, the chemistry of the molecule is actually very important. We have already now talked about several different methods, and as I said, talked about each one of those methods, I was mentioning different types of molecules. So for direct signaling, it has to be something tiny, like an ion or really, really minimalistic molecule, uh, in order to pass through the gap junction and do it fast. For Synaptic signaling, uh, neurotransmitters, they're mostly short peptides. No big deal there. They act fast. Uh, for paracrine, it can be all sorts of things. Insulin related uh, growth factors are, so peptides and uh, or small proteins or something like that. There are other things that act in a paracrine manner. For instance, nitric oxide. It's not nitrous oxide that I would be laughing at. Nitric oxide is an important chemical messenger that has a lot of function, which are not mentioned in your book, but they have lots and lots of functions in different parts of the body. Uh, and one of the main effects, paracrine effects of the secretion of nitric oxide, is vasodilation, which means opening up of capillaries, opening up of blood vessels, making the diameter wider so they can take more blood volume into them. Uh, this is the mechanism of action of Viagra. Viagra acts by stimulating an enzyme that produces nitric oxide, which then opens up the the blood vessels in the penis, allowing the blood to go in there. Uh, you are all health professionals or future health professionals. So I'm assuming that you're big fans of Grey's Anatomy. There was an episode of Grey's Anatomy where Meredith and what was her boyfriend at the time were flying on an airplane through huge turbulence, and they had like 3 or 4 patients, injuries and all sorts of things. And there was this guy who was uh, kind of an ass for a while and complaining and whatnot, and suddenly he had chest pains. He fell down, and they determined that he has. Pulmonary hypertension. Hypertension. So, what did they say? They asked the cabin, all the passenger, does anybody have Viagra? And there was this old lady says, "Here's my husband's Viagra." They gave the guy Viagra, and he recovered. What happened is that the Viagra opened up the blood vessels in the lung, allowing all of that extra blood to go through the circulation and back into the heart and the rest of the circulation instead of leaking into his alveoli and choking. So that is how nitric oxide works. It's a paracrine effect onto the blood vessels. And then for endocrine, the endocrine in a narrow sense going through the bloodstream, uh, there are different types of molecules. So for if you want uh, fast effect, but um, a lot of response, a big response, because with um, one signaling molecule resulting in amplification of the effect into thousands of resulting molecules. You want to use uh, membrane receptors. Membrane receptors, there are different types. There are ion channels. The result is going to be change of the voltage of the membrane, the difference in voltage between outside and the inside. uh, or the hormone can bind a membrane enzyme. So when the hormone binds on the inside of that protein, uh, the part of the protein, the other end of the protein that's inside of the cytoplasm acts as an enzyme, activating some biochemical reaction inside of the cell. Or it can be uh, 7 transmembrane G mediated receptor. Those are very, very common. Those are probably the most common receptors. Most protein, peptide, and polar amine uh, molecules, signaling molecules, are going to use those. All the smell receptors are using this kind of receptor, 7 transmembrane G mediated receptor. You have videos there that I posted about how exactly those receptors work. It's kind of complicated. I'm not going to ask the details about second messengers and all that stuff. But the most important thing is that the 7 transmembrane G mediated receptors are the best at amplification of the message. So you have one protein or one peptide or a amine that's polar that has a charge attaching itself to the receptor on the outside of the membrane, and then that protein goes 7 times across the membrane, and then attaches itself to the G protein, which then activates second messengers. The second messenger is going to be activated many, many times, really, really fast, and each time is going to energize an enzyme, which is energizing another enzyme, which is energizing another enzyme, and that spreads from one enzyme to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 within seconds. This is really, really fast and huge amplification of the effect. One signaling molecule can result in thousands of secreted or activated enzymes inside of the cell. Suddenly, that cell is behaving differently, it's doing something else. Um, so, this is, polar charged molecules are used for that. Uh, Non-polar are molecules that are going to be used for slower but long-lasting effects. So steroid hormones, which are lipids, easily go through cell membrane. Remember, water and oil don't mix. That's why all these kind of water-happy or hydrophilic molecules, which are hydrophilic because they have a charge, either negative or positive, so they can attract either the oxygen or the hydrogen part of the water molecules. They can't go through the oil. They can't go through the membrane because membrane is fat. But fatty molecules, hydrophobic molecules, they easily pass through other types of fat. So steroids, which are lipids, easily pass through the membrane. Nonpolar amines, like thyroid hormones and melatonin, easily pass through the membranes. But the response there is much slower, and the response there is much longer lasting. These kinds of processes with steroids and whatnot, the slow but long lasting, also result in a phenomenon that is very, very important in embryonic development and especially in the development of behavior. Um, and that is that a hormone, let's say early in the embryonic development, being secreted throughout the embryo, is going to affect all the cells in the embryo. It's going to prime them. And the best example of that is testosterone in male mammals. So early in the embryonic development, we're going to go through that a little bit later in the course. Uh, the default condition of female gets switched into male because there's SRY genes on the Y chromosome that start this whole cascade, and all the kind of development of all the female genital tract and all that stuff, uterus, ovaries, all of that gets stopped, and instead the male reproductive system is developing. One part of the male reproductive system are the two testes. The two testes, that early in the embryo, are going to start secreting testosterone, and that testosterone is going to diffuse through the entire embryo. And everywhere it goes, every single cell that it enters, what it's going to do is it's going to turn on a gene that is uh, going to force that cell to express testosterone receptor for the rest of its life, which means that we can now stop with the testosterone, and the embryo grows and the baby's born and the toddler and all that stuff. Nothing happens, and then puberty hits in, and those testes start secreting testosterone. The rest of the body, all the cells of the body, are expressing testosterone receptor. They can respond to testosterone now. They've been primed to respond to testosterone. They're going to respond in different ways. For instance, the larynx is going to enlarge in order to make deeper voice. So you have the Adam's apple, different patterns of hair growth, like beard, uh, different patterns of fat deposition, different muscle bulking, changes in the genitals, all sorts of things that are going to, what are called secondary sexual characteristics, are going to result from that exposure to testosterone during puberty. And it's only possible because all those cells were exposed briefly to small doses of testosterone very early in the embryo. Those two effects have a name. The early effect, the first effect, the one that primes, is called organizing effect of the hormone. The second effect, which means encountering the same or similar hormone later in life, allows it, if it's primed, if it has been organized, for some kind of a function to be activated. So those are organizing and activating, or organizational and activational effects of hormones. That happens only with non-polar homo uh, uh, non-polar or uh, steroids, usually mostly steroids. It doesn't really happen with melatonin and thyroid. So it's going to happen uh, in a few cases, and those are cases that often have something to do with the behaviors, female specific versus male specific behaviors, and that's studied in a lot of animals, like bird song and things like that, where it's necessary. So the organisms, multicellular organisms like animals, mammals, and humans, have evolved to have a whole suite of different chemical messengers that are used for different functions in the body at different times in different places. And their chemistry is one that determines what kind of messenger they're going to be. Tiny little ion, nitric oxide, is different from a big protein, which is different from a steroid. They are going to, because of their chemistry, be used in the body for different signaling functions. Okay, this is the first part of my endocrinology lecture. I'm going to make another one soon about homeostasis and positive and negative feedback loops. And then the third one is going to be on the specific endocrine glands and hormones. Thank you.